Good morning. We'll continue with our topic, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads, and the themes that Wordsworth has used in it. The next point we'll discuss is poetry and emotions. Emotions are of utmost importance to Wordsworth when it comes to poetry. He says, quote, "For all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings," unquote. He writes in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads regarding this, and however, Wordsworth is careful to point out that depicting emotion requires prior thought and acquired skill on the part of the poet. The poet should also be able to successfully observe and depict the thoughts and feelings that people have when they are in a state of excitement, which means the stimulation people experience in a given situation. In this way, when a poet successfully composes a poem, that poem should have a noticeable effect on its reader as it is relatable. In the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth argues that in order to compose a successful and impactful poem, the poet must immerse himself in a sort of process for poetic creation, which includes observing the subject matter, recollecting his or her emotions, contemplating those emotions, and reviving those emotions in a composition, and finally enjoying the pleasure that his or her poetry creates. For Wordsworth, a worthy poet must be able to convey his or her own emotional sensibility to the reader. He claims that emotions and thoughts are strongly intertwined. He said, quote, "For our continued influxes of feeling are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of all our past feeling," unquote. The poet must be able to understand this connection. As someone who often thinks of the relationship between thoughts and feelings will become more emotionally sensitive and aware. Then, when one such sensitive person communicates his or her thoughts, the listener, if he is in a healthy state of association, must necessarily be in some degree enlightened and his affections ameliorated. These are the words of Wordsworth, which he has written about the effect of these emotions on the person reading the poetry. In other words, when a poet successfully communicates his emotions, readers will be enlightened because the poet has the task of conveying that the spontaneous overflow of powerful healing feelings to his or her readers, and the poet must also engage in a process that allows him or her to find the right words to express himself. But first, the poet must be aware of emotions. The poet needs to have, quote, "a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind," unquote. Such a sensibility allows the poet, as Wordsworth says, slip into an entire delusion and even confound and identify his own feelings with those of the people he describes. Therefore, in this way, a poet must be a sharp observer and must be able to contemplate and process the emotions that came with his or her observations. So, the Wordsworthian poet should recollect his emotions in tranquility so that what he or she composes will be momentary but timeless. So Wordsworth claims that the poet is chiefly distinguished from other men by a greater promptness to think and feel without immediate external excitement, and a greater power in expressing such thoughts and feelings as are produced in him in that manner. The purpose of this is so that the poet can better communicate their thoughts and feelings to others. In order to excite rational sympathy, he must express himself as other men expresses themselves. So, the Wordsworthian process of poetic creation involves not just contemplating emotions in tranquility, but contemplating those emotions until, quote, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind, unquote. Therefore, in other words, the poet should calmly process the emotions he or she initially has experienced without any distraction, until he or she feels in touch with those emotions again. Then the poet may start composing. This process allows the poet to create a distance between the initial emotion and the reader in a way that tempers the painful feeling which will always be found intermingled with powerful descriptions of the deeper passions, and thus leads to a greater pleasure. The process for poetic creation has so refined the poet's composition, Wordsworth adds, that it will carry an enduring rather than momentary pleasure for its readers. For Wordsworth, the essence of poetry comes in the form of a profound rendering of emotions which helps the reader understand themselves better. As he writes in the preface, the important thing is that the feeling therein developed in a poem gives importance to the action in situation and not the action in situation to the feeling. In his eyes, hinges on emotions even more so than the actual event or situation it's describing. The next point is the poetry, nature, and humanity. At the beginning of the 19th century, when Wordsworth was writing, England was moving towards industrial revolution and urbanity. Wordsworth believed that this sort of fast life or fast pace, crowded lifestyle caused people's minds to grow numb. So he wrote not for himself but for the sake of his contemporaries, whose minds he believed were dull. He felt the need to use the subject of nature in his poetry in order to keep his readers emotionally alive and morally sensitive. He saw nature as the solution to the harms of urban life and therefore chose to center his lyrical ballads around experiences in nature. In his preface, Wordsworth highlights that his nature-centered poems have a worthy purpose in their potential to reverse the effects of urban life and revive dull minds. His poetry allows people to vicariously experience the profound joys of nature and be revived. In response to this urbanization, he felt the need to create poetry that would be well adapted to interest mankind permanently and likewise important in the multiplicity and quality of its moral relations. Wordsworth has argued that his poetry can help keep humans human by bringing them back to nature. In his preface, he writes or highlights how his nature-centered poems have the power to turn people away from this urban lifestyle and industrialization, which he believes dulls people's minds. At the time of his writing, the Industrial Revolution had recently transformed Britain. People migrated to the cities and factories began to appear everywhere. Furthermore, in Europe, political upheavals were seen of the day and people were falling for propagandic messages. Wordsworth was bitterly disappointed by the result of the French Revolution and did not want England to follow after France. In general, he disliked this trend towards urbanity, industry, mass media, and mass culture, which he felt that it was numbing the mind, and the result of which was great national events which are daily taking place and the increasing accumulation of men in cities where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident. In his eyes, these aspects of society have led people to develop bad taste. This bad taste can be seen in his disdainful reference to contemporary Gothic novels and German melodramas. Wordsworth's solution to mind, which was dulling because of the urbanization, is to bring people back to nature through poetry. Nature centered poetry allows people to experience the simple, unadulterated joys of the countryside. In his preface, he explains that the time is ripe for his ballads, which will orient readers towards nature. He writes, quote, "It has therefore appeared to me that to endeavor to produce or enlarge this capability is one of the best services in which at any period a writer can be engaged, but this service, excellent at all times, is especially so at the present day." Unquote. In other words, we can say that he thinks that the curative powers of nature and poetry are timeless and applicable to any generation, especially it was potent for his age. So the lyrical ballad represents a species of poetry which is genuine poetry that gives enjoyments of purer, more lasting and more exquisite nature. For Wordsworth, nature literature can be the antidote for depravity because such literature allows people who live in depraved society to travel to a place of nature and tranquility and experience the purity of the rustic human life. Wordsworth views nature to be one of the most important subjects with which a poet can engage. He says that there is still left open to me what confessedly constitutes the most valuable object of all writing, whether in prose or verse, the entire world of nature. The pleasure of urban life and sensational literature is temporary and it loses its effect very quickly, leading people to seek stimulants that are still more gross. The joy of nature, by contrast, is lasting and bountiful. Therefore, for Wordsworth, urban life and sensational literature has brought on the moral decline of humanity, and the best way to counter this is to bring people back to nature using romantic poetry. In his preface, Wordsworth prepares his reader to experience a stroll through the countryside, a quiet moment perched atop a cliff or a sunset by the sea, all by reading one of his ballads in the collection. These nature-centered poems, he argues, will not only revive readers and refresh their tired minds, but will also serve as a lasting source of joy. Thank you.